that we have something on the exam side of the house that has worked remarkably well, and that is before anybody gets selected for examination by reason of political activity, it goes through a committee. So no one person can do this. So, and that cuts down on the bias. We do a better job of precisely explaining why we're doing it. On the determ side, less so. So what we've done is elevated the issuance of the criteria to a higher level in the organization.
Thank you. And Mr. George?
And I would just point out, sir, of the 27, 13 were from Tea Party groups of the donor list.
Donor list. Okay.
All right. Thank you. Time has expired. Mr. Davis is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank both of you gentlemen for being here. You know, everybody that I've heard make a statement or comment, every reviewing body that has had an opinion have suggested that obviously there was some behavior on the part of senior level IRS staff that was unwarranted, unacceptable, intolerable, and of course should never happen again. It's also clear that there have been management challenges, such as who has the authority to do what relative to policy, as well as operational procedures. Mr. George, let me ask you, when did you start the audit?
Our audit, sir, began with a request from a congressional staff member in, I'm going to give you the exact date, sir, and I do have that here. March 1st of 2012 was when we were initially contacted by a government reform staff member, and our audit began in roughly May, or March rather, of 2012. I mean, we had meetings prior to that, but I would point to March of 2012.
Mr. Miller, when did you first learn of the audit or know about the audit?
Sometime in that same time frame. It would have been in March when we certainly were aware that TIGDA was taking a look at this at some juncture at that time.
And so you knew that this was underway pretty much from the beginning?
I did.
And did it ever occur, perhaps, to have certain kinds of conversations, interactions with whoever would be determined as your superiors?
I mean, I'm sure Mr. Schulman knew. I'm not sure that anybody above Mr. Schulman knew.
Let me ask you, Mr. George, doing your investigation, we've heard all kinds of allegations. As a matter of fact, some people have even been suggesting that a good thing to know is who's going to be the next person to go to jail, who's going to be indicted. Doing your investigation, did you or was it reported to you by any of your investigators that there was any apparent criminal intent or activity on the part of these employees?
Nothing out of the review, the initial review of the audit to that effect, Mr. Davis, but there will be subsequent review on our part on this matter.
You know, after listening to all of the discussion and reading all of the information that I've read, I am not convinced that this is a great big political conspiracy. I would certainly admit that there has been some ineptitude. There has been some lack of serious management procedures used and adhered to. Let me ask both of you, since you've had considerable experience with the Internal Revenue Service, what would be your recommendations to the new commissioner coming in? As a Miller?
There's no question that this is damaged the reputation of this organization, and the new commissioner needs to take steps to ensure that we've restored that trust that's so essential. And that's where he or she should take action.
Mr. George?
And I would point out, sir, and this is one of the recommendations that we make, training is necessary at all levels on a repeated basis of IRS staff, and especially in terms of the political season, you have a lot of turnover, especially at lower levels at the IRS, and people simply need to know and to be kept up to date rather, of the new regulations and requirements.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Schock is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by saying that I am most concerned that the IRS's attempt a week ago to clean up and apologize for abusing conservative organizations seeking tax-exempt status is really the proverbial tip of the iceberg. The IRS's stellar reputation of being above partisan politics has been shattered by these revelations, and these revelations now seem to be far from complete. The IRS at first revealed that the words Tea Party, Patriots, and a few other phrases triggered extra scrutiny. Since then, more and more revelations have come to light. Mr. Chairman, I have with me a 150-page document given to me by the Thomas More Society, detailing a number of pro-life organizations throughout the country, which, in application to 501c3 status, were given horrible instances of IRS abuse of power, political and religious bias, and a repression of their constitutional rights. I'm going to submit these documents detailing what these organizations went through to the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, asking for a reply to this committee about the degree of abuse these organizations received during their application for tax-exempt status. I would like to just highlight a few of those purported abuses and ask for your opinion on them. In a letter from the IRS Office of Exempt Organization Specialist in El Monte, California, specifically the Pacific Coast Division, I would note this is not in the Cincinnati Division, to the Christian Voices for Life of Fort Bend County in Sugar Land, Texas, dated March 31st, 2011, that I have here with me today. They were asked specifically, again, this is a pro-life group, in your educational program, do you do education on both sides of the issues in your programs? Mr. Miller, your knowledge of the 501c3 application, is that an appropriate question to ask?
So I'm going to be honest, and I'm not going to be able to speak to a specific development letter in a specific case. I don't know that I can do that under 6103.
Okay, let me ask you about another letter that was received by a pro-life group, this one in Iowa. Their question specifically asked from the IRS to the Coalition for Life of Iowa, quote, please detail the content of the members of your organization's prayers. Would that be an appropriate question to a 501c3 applicant? The content of one's prayers.
It pains me to say I can't speak to that one either, but that's an...
You don't know whether or not that would be an appropriate question to ask an applicant?
Speaking outside of this case, which I don't know anything about, it would surprise me that that question was asked.
And finally, during another applicant's employees of the IRS, did you ask them specifically whether or not these letters from sitting United States senators influenced or impacted their decisions around these cases?
I do not believe that was part of the inquiry, sir.
Will you ask those questions in the future?
I will ask that if appropriate. We will certainly do so if appropriate.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'm particularly troubled by some on this committee who seem to want to rationalize or justify the inappropriate behavior by the IRS in these cases by their disagreement with the Citizen United ruling of our Supreme Court. I think we all know that our nation is a nation of laws, and we either abide by those laws or not, to our peril. And whether we agree with the Citizens United ruling or not should not be justification for this agency, which is charged with upholding the rule of law equitably for all people in all groups, regardless of party affiliation or motive. Specifically, Mr. Miller, I was troubled by your comment that you found this grouping Mr. George with the Inspector General's office calls it targeting, to be inappropriate but not illegal. I'm wondering if you can give me examples of other targeting within the IRS that you're aware of that would be inappropriate but not illegal.
So I probably, Congressman, should tell you that I don't know. It's my belief that what happened here wasn't illegal, but I suppose there are some facts that might come out that would indicate otherwise. But it's not my area. I don't know, but it certainly was inappropriate. No question about that. I'm unaware. We have used listings elsewhere.
Can you give
in
a
the
few
credit,
examples?
Credit counseling organization would be one of those that we used a name to pull those cases together to work in a consistent and fair manner.
All right, time has expired. Ms. Jenkins is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've heard a lot of outrage, a lot of anger and disappointment, but I have to tell you, after sitting here for a couple hours, I'm sad and I'm sick to my stomach that Americans could be targeted by a government agency based on their political beliefs. Mr. Miller, in response to Congressman Nunes, you mentioned that you had a discussion with Treasury, someone at Treasury, regarding the TICTA report. I was just wondering if you could give us more details about when that conversation occurred and with whom.
So I don't know the precise date, but it would have been very recently after the report was done. And I think Mr. George can speak to when he indicated to some parts of Treasury as well. It might have been in the same time frame.
So would that have been the first time you had a discussion with someone from Treasury about this situation?
This situation being the listing and the treatment of these cases?
Correct.
I think so.
So out of all of the news reports that have come out in the last couple years, there was never a discussion at IRS with Treasury about the situation until just recently?
You asked the question was the TICTA report, and the TICTA report was described and discussed with them recently. I don't believe the specifics were described or discussed with them earlier, but I don't know that. They weren't by me, I don't think.
Okay, who was your conversation with?
I would have talked at some point to Mr. Patterson, the Chief of Staff, and subsequent to Mr. George's discussion with Mr. Wolin, I spoke to Mr. Wolin.
You spoke with who?
Mr. Wolin.
Mr. Wolin?
Wolin.
And how did that conversation go? What did Treasury have to say?
We just talked through the troubling nature of the reports. I indicated that we had worked on fixing the problem, and that's what we talked about.
They didn't give you any advice and counsel on how to move forward?
No.
Okay, Mr. George,
Yes.
how often do you meet with Treasury leadership and IRS leadership regarding open audits?
With the IRS leadership, we meet monthly with the commissioner or acting commissioner on a standing basis, and then we'll have communications as necessary. The secretary holds a monthly meeting with bureau heads, and in conjunction with those meetings, I meet monthly with the general counsel of the Department of the Treasury, and then on an as-needed basis with the deputy secretary, Mr. Wolin.
Okay, when did you first alert Treasury leadership and IRS leadership about this specific audit?
I alerted then Commissioner Shulman on May 30th, 2012. I subsequently alerted the General Counsel of the Department of the Treasury on June 4th, and subsequently, and I do not have the exact date, alerted the Deputy Secretary, Neil Wolin, about this matter, and then upon his assumption into the position, I mentioned it to Secretary Liu.
Okay, so May 30th would have been the first time that Mr. Shulman would have known about the troubling allegations.
from my perspective, I would assume that people within the Internal Revenue Service would have given him a heads up about this troubling matter, but I can't say that for certain.
Okay. In your report, you indicate that the decisions to target Americans based on political beliefs were made only within the IRS. How did you determine that?
These were through interviews with IRS staffers both in Cincinnati, Ohio, as well as in Washington, D.C. at the headquarters of the Determinations Unit and the Exempt Organizations Unit.
So did you interview Mr. Miller?
We did not interview Mr. Miller.
So how would you know, or did you interview anyone at Treasury?
We did not, and the reason for that is because at the time of our interviews, we had no indication, because this was an ongoing matter, and we didn't have any indication from those initial interviews that they were implicated in this matter.
So had anyone given you any indication that you needed to visit with someone higher, you would have had the authority to?
Most definitely.
All right, time has expired. Mr. Paulson's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There have been a lot of news reports this week that this has been a bad week for the president or a bad week for the administration, but I will just tell you after hearing additional testimony this morning myself that this is a bad week for America. That's the bottom line. And when supposedly neutral actors in our government choose sides and the results end up being highly corrosive to our democracy, this is a violation clearly of the trust of the American people. Mr. George, your report indicated, and you've testified, that the IRS improperly requested donor lists from targeted organizations. Obviously, that's a concern from the perspective of a pattern of behavior at the IRS based on the report from delays of applications and targeting and also the dissemination of confidential information. But let me ask you this. How long did the IRS, because you acknowledged this just earlier from 27 different organizations, how long did the IRS have in its possession these lists, these improperly lists that they shouldn't have had in their possession from 27 different organizations?
Congressman, they did not indicate, and we did inquire, the length of time that they have maintained that information, but again, that they did acknowledge that once they realized they should not have collected it, they destroyed it. But I do not have a direct answer as to how long they held on to it.
Mr. Miller, do you know how long the improperly obtained lists were in the IRS's possession?
I don't know, and I look, the letters were bad. They were just way too broad. Should they have asked for them? Probably not. Was it bad intent or bad management? My guess and my understanding, bad management. When we found out about it, we reached out to people who hadn't sent them yet, and we told them, don't send them. We went to people who had sent them, and told them we're not going to use them unless we need to, and we didn't. And at that point, my understanding is that we did not use them in any of those cases, and they're not being retained. They would have been destroyed in the ordinary course of our records retention rules.
Mr. George, were you able to confirm that the lists were actually destroyed, and if so, how were you able to confirm that?
It's through the testimony, the interviews that were conducted by our auditors. Now, I have to admit that that was not done under oath, but we have to go by what we were told by the employees.
Mr. George, do you have any idea how many donors were involved as a part of those lists?
Again, 27 is my understanding of the list of donors requested. Okay. So within the list, I'm not sure. But as I pointed out, 13 of the 27 were from Tea Party groups.
Okay. Mr. Miller, let me ask you this. Is it IRS practice to ask about a group's relationship with a specific person who's not a part of an organization that is applying for nonprofit status as a part of an application process?
So it can be, depending on the facts, based on, is there a contractual relationship that could be an issue? Is there undue influence going on in some fashion that, if, for example, we would be looking at enormment, we would be looking at private benefit. The one other thing, I want you to know that the donor lists, because I want to just make it clear, 13 were Tea Party. but I believe, and my numbers are just a little different, one way or another. But the Tea Party ones include 912 Patriots. The listing folks were the minority of the people who got the donor questions. I just want to clarify the record there.
Sure. Mr. Miller, has the IRS ever asked the question of an individual? Have they ever asked, what's your relationship with John Doe? When they ask an organization is applying status, is that a common practice? Have you asked that question?
I'm sorry, can you rephrase that, sir?
Well, Mr. Teaberry was going down a line of questioning earlier about a lengthy process of a questionnaire that was filed with an organization, and the IRS had asked the question on number 26 of an individual, provide details regarding your relationship with this individual. Is that a common practice? Does the IRS normally do that?
So I don't know what we're talking about there, and it's on an individual case, and I really should not and cannot speak to an individual case, sir. I'm sorry.
Would it be safe to say that knowing that that's probably inappropriate, would there be repercussions or some sort of discipline that might be followed up if that was determined to be inappropriate on that type of a question?
It would depend on the context again, and I don't have the context and why it was asked, and was it a lack of controls, and was it a mistake, or was it something different than that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Right. Thank you. Mr. Marchant is recognized.
Mr. Miller, let's go back to the IRS planted question issue. When was Cecilia Rhodey told to ask the question?
I don't have exact knowledge on that. I did not do that.
Who told her to ask the question?
I don't know, actually. I'm not sure. It might have been Lois Lerner, but I really am not sure.
What did you tell her about the background of the issue?
What did I tell who?
Rhodey.
I did not have any conversations with Celia.
Did anyone give her an advanced copy of the IG's report?
Don't believe so, but again, I did not have those conversations, but I would be shocked if that happened.
And how long did she know about the report before the committee knew?
Again, you'd have to ask the people who had the conversation, but again, it would shock me if she knew anything before she had the conversation with whomever she had it with.
On March the 28th, I wrote the commissioner a letter that basically asked him whether local Tea Party groups in my district were being harassed or given lengthy questionnaires and were being discouraged from seeking tax-exempt status. That was March 28th. On June the 22nd, I got a letter from Mr. Grant that basically gave me a lot of assurances that nothing like that was taking place and that nothing out of the ordinary was going on and that they were following just regular order. Then, following a timeline, shortly before my first letter, Mr. Bustani asked in a oversight hearing, if there was anything going on over at IRS about these applications. And he was told by Commissioner Schulman, I can give you assurances there is absolutely no targeting going on. Following that same timeline, on July the 25th, we had another oversight committee hearing in which Commissioner Miller and I had an extended conversation about this very subject. And that conversation is in this transcript. Anyone can get this on the internet and can read the questions, but the questions were very specifically about Tea Party groups and their difficulties in getting their tax-exempt status, the lengthy conversations that they were having, the questionnaires that they were having to answer. And again, Mr. Miller, in that exchange that you and I had, I came away from that with, I felt, the assurances by you and your office that there were no extraordinary circumstances taking place and that this was just a backlog and there was nothing going on. Mr. Miller, was that your impression of the hearing that day?
No, sir. What I said there and what I understood your question to be was, again, we divide this world in two. There's a question of the selection process, and there's a question of what was going on at the time of your question. At the time of your question, what was out in the public domain and what I thought we were discussing was the letters, as you call the questionnaires. Those were the overbroad letters that had been referred to continuously here. Again, I stand by my answer there. There was not, I did talk about the fact that we had centralized, I believe, I have to take a look at it, but I was talking about the fact that we had fixed that problem, and that's...
But at that time, you knew by that time that there were lists being made, there were delineations, there was discrimination going on, and that there were steps being taken to try to correct it, but you knew that it was going on at that time.
We had corrected it. TIGTA was taking a look. At that time, my assumption is TIGTA was going to be done with their report that summer. I was not going to go there because I did not have full possession of all the facts, sir.
Well, this is a list of questions that, in my case, my local Northeast Tarrant County Tea Party was sent. And it's a list that most taxpayers would not answer, and most taxpayers should not have to answer. But it asks some questions that should have never been asked. A printed copy of every page of your website, every tweet from your Twitter account, every personal resumes from all your board members, copies of every flyer you ever made and every flyer any guest speaker ever handed out. Explain your relationship with True the Vote, a copy of every single email ever sent by our group. This is a list that is overly burdensome, and in my case, it has led to a deep discouragement on these parties, and it has limited their ability to educate the public. Can I find out, as a member of Congress, the groups in my district that have applied for and either been denied or their application continues to be in suspension?
With Mr. Camp's help, you could, granting us 6103 authorities,
Yeah.
but the application process until it's done is 6103 information.
Right.
And if it's denied, then there is redacted versions going out, and if it's approved, then everything becomes public. So within the constraints of 6103, which Mr. Camp can grant you the ability to see, that could happen.
Yield back.
Time has expired. Yes, I think there would be restrictions on my sharing that with Mr. Marchant, however. So Ms. Black is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to go back to what Mr. Paulson said a few minutes ago, because as I sit here and listen to this testimony, having read the report and multiple sources of information that are now coming out, I got to tell you that the trust for the IRS to begin with was already shaky by the American people. And I know whenever someone gets any piece of information from the IRS, it doesn't feel very good, and they're not very confident, even before this happened, that they're going to be treated fairly. But what has happened here in this testimony that we're getting today is very disturbing. And I want to say what Mr. Price said. If I were sitting at home watching this on C-SPAN, I would probably be questioning again, well, there doesn't seem to be clarity here. How can I trust? Let me go back to, as I'm listening to your testimony and your opening remarks, you referred to this as foolish mistakes. And then you acknowledged in the response to Mr. Rangel that there was abuse. So this was more than just foolish mistakes, this was abuse. And then you said to Mr. Ryan's response that you felt that the applicants were dealt with fairly. And then you turned around and said, answering to Mr. O'Neill, that there was a litmus test that was a political activity. And you then said politics is always where we ask questions in these kinds of applications. I want to go to page number 6 on the report that does talk about the words that were used, like Tea Party and Patriots, and then at another point in time, issues including government spending, debt, taxes, public advocacy and lobbying to make America better. And I want to know, if you say that, yes, there is a litmus test and that politics is always where we ask questions anytime there's an application that seems to go there, can you give me some other words that would have been used beside what appears to me to be all conservative questions? Was there a progressive that we should look for anything in the application then that says progressive? Was that anywhere?
So I think and I'll refer to Mr. George's statement. I believe his statement indicated what my understanding is, which is this was not the only thing that our folks were looking at as they scanned.
But you're not answering my question. Was there anything in any of this criteria that was outside of what I'm seeing in this report that would have indicated to me that other than conservative groups who were applying for this status, that you had a word in there anywhere to say, okay, the litmus test is this seems to be political. So we always look at political. Where's the word progressive? Where's the
I'm not arguing that the list was bad and that the list was conservative based. What
then
I'm saying
I would
is
say,
more than that.
excuse me, I'm going to reclaim my time on this, because then I would say it's targeted. You can't have that both ways. That's targeting, and there's 16 times in this report that says that there was targeting. So I believe that as you're giving this testimony that you can't have that both ways. Now, there's also ineffective management that is talked about in this report, and even if you get outside of this and say, okay, there was no targeting, I want to know how a couple of employees that are considered low level could have done what was done here, because this says to the American people that out of thousands of employees that you have at the IRS, there's ineffective management there. Nobody's watching this. If this was noted in 2010 and in 2013 we're just now finding out about this, that certainly is ineffective management, because there should have been somebody that was overlooking this that said, this must stop, and I'm going to come back in 30 days to make sure it stopped. But it continued and it continued, and now we've got 400 applications, some of them over 3 years. This is more than ineptitude. I mean, this is more than just mismanagement. And I know my time's going to run out here, so Mr. George, I want to come to you, because you told Ms. Jenkins that you told the General Counsel of the Treasury on June the 4th.
Correct.
You could not recall the exact date that you told the Deputy Secretary, Neil Wallen. Do you recall if it was soon after informing the General Counsel? Was it like a week, a month?
I cannot give a time frame, but I can say that it was shortly thereafter.
Okay, could we get that date? Is that possible to get that date?
You know, unfortunately, I don't keep a date planner, but I'll do my best,
Okay.
Ms. Black. And
Thank
if
you.
so, if I have it, I will certainly
Thank
supply
you
it
very
to the
much.
committee.
All right, Mr. Reed is recognized. Sorry, time has expired.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Miller, Mr. George, we've sat here for quite some time, and I will tell you that this is offensive. This is offensive to hear this testimony. And what I like to do is, I know you're disagreeing with the word targeting, Mr. Miller. I suggest the American people will make that determination, and I'll give this whole situation a name. It's the IRS targeting gate. I'll put it right out there. And we're going to get to the bottom of it. And we're going to keep on this until we're done. As you sit here today, you were not fired from your job. And I can tell you, in my private experience, you would have been fired on the spot. And all you were allowed to do is resign and retire. And now you come here and somehow try to say, I did the honorable thing by falling on my sword, when nothing bad is going to happen to you. You're going to get your full benefits. You're going to get everything that's associated with your retirement as an IRS employee.
Nothing bad is happening to me, Congressman.
Yeah, financially, you're allowed to retire. That's the level of accountability in Washington, D.C. now. You're still acting. You came here on the taxpayer dollar today. You're getting a paycheck for being here today, correct? Correct?
Correct.
Yeah. I want to know who, what, where, and you know, when my good colleague, my good friend from Michigan, Mr. Levin, started this, he said, we need to ask the who, what, where, and how. One question he didn't put in his opening comment was why. And we have dodged and weaved this whole time for this entire hearing as to why this happened. And I don't think we're going to get an answer to it today. But Mr. George, I want to get to the bottom of your report, and I appreciate the work you've done. You referenced that there was gross mismanagement in regards to this situation. I want to know who you identified that had the responsibility to manage this situation. I want names. I want to know where they worked, when they worked, and what they did.
Do you want it? Well,
Right now.
Lois Lerner is the primary individual who is located in Washington. Joseph Grant was her supervisor. He too was located in Washington. And located in Cincinnati, there were a number of people. A director named Holly Patz, P-A-Z. She was the acting director for a significant period of time that this was occurring. And then there were various management, technical unit managers and the like. And I could supply a full listing of those names at your request.
That is my request, and I would formally request that.
But Mr. Reed, may I please beg your indulgence? I need to make something clear in response to both Ms. Black and Mr. Paulson. When I had my discussions with the commissioner and with the secretary and the general counsel, it was not to inform them of the results of the audit. It was to inform them of the fact that we were conducting the audit. And I just want to make sure.
Well, let's follow up on that. When you had that conversation with the secretary, when exactly did that occur?
That happened shortly after he took office. So it was after the policy had already been stopped and the issues have been, we hope, resolved.
And Mr. George, as a country lawyer from Western New York, you made some comments in your testimony about the partisanship determination. You kept referencing something that I've seen many times in my legal career, at this time. That implies to me that there are additional investigations coming down the pipeline that potentially could uncover such information. Isn't that correct?
That is an accurate statement, sir.
And I will be eagerly awaiting those future investigations. And I applaud your work, and I can ask you to continue to do that work. Mr. Miller, I just want to understand exactly, as we just had identified with Mr. George, numerous people in your organization that you had oversight, ultimate oversight for, his ability to identify those individuals. You didn't identify those individuals in any type of management oversight when you became aware of this situation in May of 2012 and reached out to those individuals?
I certainly was aware of my own management chain, yes, sir.
Okay. And so who in your management chain specifically did you talk to about this situation?
After May, you mean, of 2012?
After you became aware of it, you said you talked with your people in your management chain.
I'm sure I talked to Joseph Grant. I probably talked to Lois as well.
Just those two. That's all you talked to.
Well, I talked to the folks who went out and worked on the case, and I mentioned Nan Marks in that regard.
Okay, that was Nancy Marks who
Yes.
who was in Cincinnati that you orally disciplined.
No. Nancy Marks was a senior technical advisor who led a team to take a look at this in Cincinnati.
And who was the employee again that you orally disciplined that you thought may had something to do with it?
I apologize, I don't remember the name. We can give it to you. I'll just have to give it to you after the hearing.
And then you said that person who was orally disciplined probably wasn't involved in it, but there was a potential another employee. Who is that other employee?
So let me go back, because there were two employees, one of whom was reassigned, one of whom I asked to be orally counseled. The one that was to be orally counseled, they have informed me may not have been the right person. They pulled all the managers in to talk to them in lieu of an individual that they didn't know which one was which.
And do you have those names?
I'll have to send them to you, sir.
Yeah, I would formally request for the record those names.
Okay. All right, thank you. Mr. Young's recognized.
Mr. Miller, I want to know why all of this happened. You and Ms. Lerner have said over the past week that IRS officials started targeting Americans for their political beliefs in March of 2010. That was after observing a surge in applications for status as 501c4. So that was your rationale. To support this claim, you both cited an increase from about 1,500 applications in 2010 to nearly 3,500 in 2012. But data contained in the IG audit says the targeting began in March 2010, before this uptick. In fact, the audit, all Ms. Lerner's name, stated March 16, 2012. In that letter, she directs a conservative Indiana group to comply with a previously sent inappropriate information request under penalty of perjury. I have that request here. So 1 year after she said she stopped this practice, Ms. Lerner sent a letter demanding the group fulfill a request she had already determined to be inappropriate. A request that included a demand for donor information. This strikes me as peculiar, to say the least, and it seems to contradict claims that somebody at the IRS tried to stop the harassment in 2011. Further, this Indiana group had their 501c4 status denied on February 18, 2013. But 4 days later, on February 22nd, 2013, their 501c4 request was granted, even though they never provided the required information. So after seeing these actions and an approval of an application that looks a lot to me like someone was covering their tracks over that 4-day period, how can I assure my constituents that employees of the IRS aren't targeting conservative groups they disagree with?
So let me put this in sort of time order, because I think there's some fundamental mashing of issues. There are two issues here. One is the list issue, which began about the time you say it did, I believe, and one is how we processed the cases. The donor list letter, and I'm not speaking because I don't know that case, but the donor list letter issue occurred much later in time. It actually occurred, I believe, and I'll have to go back and check this, but I believe it occurred after Lois had stepped in and stopped the listing, the first issue. The development of those cases was still problematic. We had not gotten to the bottom of that, and that's why that would have been the case. I don't have an answer for you on the last piece of that.
Wait a second here. She said she'd resolved this situation. She said she had stopped the targeting of conservative groups. A year later, she demands a group fulfill a request for the inappropriate information. I don't believe you've addressed that issue, sir.
So
You've got 30 seconds left to do so.
I apologize. First, you should know, while her signature is on there, her signature is on 70,000 applications, so let's not personalize this one to Ms. Lerner. Secondly, and probably more importantly, I think that, again, my understanding and what I think Mr. George has said is that in 2011, June or July, whatever it was, she handled and fixed the list issue. The cases were still in development. The cases needed to be in development. There were issues. We just did a remarkably bad time of it.
All right, sir. And then it's just curious, I'll reiterate, a denial on February 18, 2013, and then a granting 4 days later. It does look a bit fishy there. We'll have to clarify that.
Time has expired. You'll have to respond in writing. Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. George, you have been on the job since November of 2004, is that correct? In your current position?
2004.
Anything rise to this level before?
No, nothing.
Can I ask, why did it take so long from the first time we knew that this was happening to got the report done? I met the president said just the other day, I think it was yesterday, that he just got a look at the report, and that's the first time he knew anything about it.
Well, first,
other than reading it in the papers, I guess.
Are you asking how?
Yeah. So, have you ever seen that magnitude before? Anything
No,
this magnitude?
no.
It's never come up before.
No, it has not.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Miller. Now, you've been on the job for quite some years, but the current job you're in is from November 9th, 2012. So, is that right? So you just took over as acting commissioner.
In November of 12, yes. I have both jobs.
All right. But before that, one of your jobs, you were the Commissioner of Tax Exempt and Government Entities Division. So you actually were in the job that we're questioning now, that group of what was happening there. So would you have been in Cincinnati?
No.
You were never in Cincinnati?
No.
So is Cincinnati some outpost?
So obviously the IRS is a nationwide organization.
Oh, I know. I understand that. I understand that.
PODs.
And I want to tell you, listen, believe me, if you think it's uncomfortable sitting over there, you ought to be a private individual when the IRS is across from you questioning. So I got to tell you, it's uncomfortable for everybody. But my question more specifically is, so how did Cincinnati get to where they are? How did they develop that strategy? And how did they know to go after these certain groups? How did they target those folks? That just a couple rookies just showed up, didn't really know what they were doing?
So again, I would point to the TIGDA report on what happened.
No, I understand that. But I'm hearing these are low-level people that push the wrong button. Now, when Cincinnati can't figure out, who do they confer with? Who's their counsel? When they're looking at these entities, tax-exempt entities. Does it come back here to D.C.?
There's two possibilities.
Yes or no? Does it come back to D.C.?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So D.C. and Cincinnati will be pretty well connected in understanding what's going on. So this doesn't come as a great shock to anybody In fact, I would say it doesn't come as a shock. You know what it does for the American people? It really establishes what they fear so often. I have a grandson who's afraid to get out of bed at night because he thinks there's somebody under the bed that's going to grab him. And I think most Americans feel that way about the IRS. I mean, you get a letter from you folks or a phone call, it's with terror that you look at it. And now this kind of reconfirms that, you know what? They can do almost anything they want to anybody they want, anytime they want. This is very chilling for the American people. Now, I know that where you're at, you're resigning, you're walking away from it. But this is not going to go away. This is a Pandora's box that has been opened, and I don't think we can get the lid back on it. And I don't believe that the White House just found out about this in a news report. The president happened to grab a TV shot where just read Mr. George's report and said, you know what, anybody heard about this before? I'm just getting a first look at this. Shouldn't somebody be responsible? And I'm thinking maybe the executive office, maybe Treasury falls in there. I'm not sure that we understand how that organizational chart works, but I am really concerned. Now, I got to tell you, where you're sitting, you should be outraged, but you're not. The American people should be outraged, and they are. And this committee, this has nothing to do with political parties. This has to do with highly targeted groups. This reconfirms everything that the American public believes. This is a huge blow to the faith and trust that the American people have in their government. Is there any limit to the scope of where you folks can go? Is there anything at all? Is there any way that we could ask you, is there any question you shouldn't have asked? My goodness, how much money do you have in your wallet? Who do you get emails from? Whose sign do you put up in your front yard? This is a tax question? And you don't think that's intimidating? It's sure as hell intimidating. And I don't know that I got any answers from you today. And I don't know that what Mr. George has done is great work. But you know what? There's a heck of a lot more that has to come out in this. And anybody to sit here today and listen to what you have to say, I am more concerned today than I was before. And the fact that you all can do just about anything you want to anybody, you know, you can put anybody out of business that you want anytime you want. And I got to tell you, you talked about you're a horribly run organization. If you're on the other side of the fence, you're not given that excuse. And when the IRS comes in, you're not allowed to be shoddy. You're not allowed to be run horribly. You're not allowed to make mistakes. You're not allowed to do one damn thing that doesn't come in compliance. If you do, you're held responsible right then. I just think the American people have seen what's going on right now in their government. This is absolutely an overreach, and this is an outrage for all America. I yield back.
All right. Mr. Griffin is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you,
All right. The committee will come to order. We'll have order in the committee. Mr. Griffin's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to make a couple comments first. You know, the surge in these groups that are the subject of this hearing is not related to a Supreme Court case, if there was a surge at all. It's related to the nonsense in Washington. That's why people were getting engaged. In fact, the Supreme Court case has been so much discussed here, has no bearing on these groups. Ultimately, that's ridiculous. What this hearing has demonstrated for me that our most expansive federal powers are given to our most intrusive agency. And then you add on top of that incompetence or whatever else we have, and it's a disaster. You know, my colleague here talks about asking people how much money they've got in their wallet. I got a text last night at dinner from a friend of mine who's a supporter in Arkansas, in Little Rock. He's being audited. Yesterday morning, he had to meet with the IRS. He was outraged. He sent me a text. He said, they asked me, how much cash do you carry in your wallet? How much cash does your wife carry in her wallet? Do you use the internet? You know, I don't care what rules are written down or not written down. These people ought to have enough common sense to know that this is just stupid to ask this kind of stuff. And if they don't know that on their own without something written in a regulation, they ought to quit or be fired. It's craziness. Now, I've known you for a long time, General, and I've looked at your investigation. I appreciate the work you've done. It's really an audit. Let's be clear to the press. This is not an investigation. You did not request emails. You did not do what you would do in an investigation. There's a reason you don't know who came up with this. You didn't investigate that. You might be now. Are you?
I'm not in a position, sir, to discuss whether or not.
That means you are. Okay. So the bottom line is, the bottom line is, for those looking, this is an audit and it's helpful, but it's the tip of the iceberg. It's the tip of the iceberg. It's looking at metrics and interviewing some folks. We worked together years ago up here on the hill, right in the building next to us. And we know how important emails are. And I trust that you're going to get to the bottom of the emails. Now let me just mention real quickly. If you want to know where a lot of this comes from, look at Senator Levin's letter. Senator Levin specifically mentioned a bunch of the groups that y'all targeted. The other senators made the points, but they didn't mention specific groups. It was Senator Levin's letter. To some extent, y'all were doing what Democrat senators were asking. A lot of the press here ought to go to the Senate when you're done and ask them some questions. Now, with regard to Sarah Hall Ingram, you may have been confused as to when she worked there, but she was there from 2009 to 2012. You said you had horrendous customer service. And what happened to her? She got $100,000 in bonuses, and she was promoted. Wow. Incredible. You said the buck stops with you. Well, it stopped with her before that. She was directly in charge of these rules, of this targeting. What'd she get? Bonuses, and moved to a job. And you know what her job is now? She's coordinating Section 1414 of Obamacare. What is that? That's the provision that says that there is an exemption or an exception to disclosure of tax information. What is that? That means the Treasury can share your tax information with HHS for the purposes of implementing Obamacare to see whether you have got a really expensive health care plan or what have you. It's right there in Section 1414. So she provided horrendous customer service under her watch, and now she's going to do the same implementing Obamacare. Swell. This is a perfect example of why we need tax reform. If you want to diminish and limit the power of the IRS, you've got to reduce the complexity of the tax code and take them out of it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Renacci is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, as a CPA who's represented many taxpayers in the last 3 decades, I am really appalled. I'm really appalled that the agency was able to take these actions. Mr. George, you made a comment. You said that these actions, even though they were contrary to the Treasury policy at the IRS, it was not illegal but inappropriate. Mr. Miller, if a taxpayer was in front of your agency and they did something that was contrary to Treasury policy, would that be illegal or inappropriate?
If they did something contrary, no. It would
Treasury policy on their tax return.
No, we would be auditing them.
I know you'd be auditing them, but I've